Chapter 070. Carried away. Deep beneath Cyoria, in a recently excavated cavern separated from the main tunnel network, an army was being assembled. It consisted of about 200 people, about 120 of which had been gathered by Olenek through various means, while the rest were mercenaries Zorian had hired for considerable amounts of money. Of course, this number did not include the many non-combat experts that would be responsible for figuring out how the Abasin Gate functioned. Nor did it take into account the many golems that Zorian had made for the occasion, about 80 of which were scattered through the area, or the 40 Iranian mercenaries that were hired from the 3 different webs recommended by the Silent Doorway adepts. As far as armies went, this wasn't much. But it was still a sizable group, and getting it past Abasin patrols without them noticing their passage was difficult. For ordinary mages, that is. Zorian could just send his simulacrum to sneak past these patrols and then just open a gate to let the assembled forces through unmolested and unnoticed. There was something very amusing about using dimensional gates to bypass Abasin patrols, establishing a temporary staging ground deep in their territory, and then launching a surprise attack at their base. Zorian was just in the process of attaching small metal cylinders to his belt, each one filled with potent alchemical mixtures, when he sensed Zack approaching him. "You look worried," Zack told him. Zorian frowned. He didn't notice it before Zack pointed it out, but yeah, he kind of was. "A little," Zorian admitted, continuing his preparations. "I mean, we're risking another confrontation with Quatakikl here. He's one of the few people who has the ability to do us lasting harm. Every time we tangle with him, we're taking a big risk." It'll be fine," Zack said dismissively, giving him a strong pat on the back that had Zorian swaying in place for a second. He gave Zack a glare for that, but his fellow time traveler just grinned at him in response. "Besides, the annoying pile of bones isn't nearly as dangerous as you think. I've fought him plenty of times and I'm still standing. He doesn't like to use necromancy in battle for some reason." Olenek, who was staring at the map of the Abasin base along with Svim, decided this merited a response from him. "Most necromantic spells aren't well suited for battle," Olenek said, not taking his eyes off the map. "They take too much concentration and they need to overcome the target's magic resistance to work. It's faster and cheaper to just burn people to a crisp or cut them to pieces. The terrible necromantic spells that are sometimes bandied about in textbooks are torture spells meant to be inflicted on a subdued victim, not something you use in an even fight." There was a long pause as Zack and Zorian digested this. One of these days Zorian decided he really had to ask Olenek about his past. The old battle priest would likely refuse to talk about it at first, but maybe if he picked a right moment and was really persistent? Well, whatever. It was a thought for some other time. He considered pointing out that a fight between them and Quatakikl wasn't exactly an even one, since the difference in power and skill between the ancient lich and any one of them was still a yawning chasm rather than anything resembling a close matchup, but he figured that would be missing the point. Alanek's point was that Quatakikl likely didn't go for necromantic magic in a fight because it was suboptimal, and that was probably true. Getting into a habit of toying with your opponents was quite stupid, and the ancient lich had been shrewd enough to survive for more than 1,000 years now. Truth be told, Zorian found those jagged disintegration beams that Quatakikl liked to use to be plenty terrifying in their own way. "You know," Zorian suddenly said, "my past self would be horrified if he saw me right now." "Why?" Zack asked, arching his eyebrow in askance. "This attack is pretty audacious," said Zorian. "There is no way my past self would ever consider this a reasonable risk to take. A part of me scoffs at this, dismissing it as simple cowardice, but there is another part of me that can't help but wonder whether the time loop had eroded away my ability to recognize what is and is not appropriately cautious behavior. What if we manage to leave the time loop and deal with Red Robe, only to die 2 months later because we did something completely stupid out of sheer habit?" To Zorian's surprise, Zack actually seemed to give the question some serious thought. Zorian expected him to either dismiss his concerns or question how Zorian could possibly know what his past self would have thought of their current situation. Instead, Zack seemed to consider the issue in his head for well over a minute before responding. "I doubt that's going to happen," he eventually said, his tone and mannerisms somewhat subdued. "I have things I need to do after we get out. Social things. It will be at least a year or 2 before I can start picking fights with dragons or whatnot, and I don't think you'll start looking for trouble without me prodding you. A couple of years should be enough to let us adjust to a world without restarts, right?" Zorian simply gave Zack a non-committal hum in response. Zack had a pretty rosy picture of Zorian in his head if he thought there was no way he could get himself into trouble on his own. Zorian still wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his life when they got out of the time loop, but he would probably need a lot of money and rare resources. He could easily imagine getting into trouble in the process of acquiring these, or once he amassed enough that people start to take notice, or once he told people what he was actually doing with all these acquisitions. Zack's inordinate fondness for picking fights with giant monsters was definitely dangerous, but Zorian suspected his personal ambitions could be even more dangerous than that. A mage of Zack's caliber can usually flee from giant monsters if they find themselves overmatched against it. Make a human organization interested enough in you though, and they will hound you till the day you die. He shook his head and steeled himself. Now was not the time to contemplate those topics too deeply. The opening moves of this attack were about to begin, and Zorian had a crucial role to play in them. If they wanted to stop Quatakikl from being alerted and summoned back to the base, someone had to sneak into the base and either assassinate or disable as many Abasan leaders as possible before the main force of the attack hit. That someone was, of course, Zorian. Him and the Iranian mercenaries he had hired for the occasion, that is. Cloaking one's presence thoroughly enough to avoid dedicated scrutiny was quite hard. In a contest between two equally skilled mages, one of which was trying to hide and one of which was seeking for the hidden one, the seeker would almost always come out on top. If your opponent could manipulate your very mind, however, dictating what you see, hear and remember, then even the most sophisticated detection spell could not help you find them. Well, that was the theory at least. Zorian was quite sure the Abasans would catch on to their presence relatively soon. Mind magic was not exactly unknown among mages, even if few of them could manifest it as stealthily and flexibly as Zorian and his new Iranian minions could. So, they didn't have to stay undetected forever. Just long enough to track down and remove anyone who knew how to contact Quatakikl. "I'm going," Zorian said out loud, speaking to himself as much as he was to the people around him. "Leave a simulacrum with us," warned Alanik. Zorian hesitated for a moment. He had dismissed all his simulacrums before the operation began so that they wouldn't be a drain on his mana reserves. It was annoying because it meant he would have to rely on Daimen again to re-establish a link with Koth, but he felt this operation deserved his full focus. That said, Zorian shouldn't be doing anything too mana-intensive during the initial infiltration, so maybe leaving a simulacrum behind in the command room wouldn't be a bad idea. He executed a complex series of chants and gestures and then cupped his hands in front of him, causing a milky white sphere of ectoplasm to materialize in front of him. He felt the spell reach towards his soul, connecting it to the ball of ectoplasm in front of him. The moment he felt the connection snap into place, he plunged his right arm straight into the ball of ectoplasm and imposed upon it an image of himself, causing it to squirm and writhe like a living thing. "That always looks so freaky," Zack commented off to the side. Zorian ignored him. This was the most sensitive part of the spell, since the caster had to keep their image firmly in mind as they manipulated the ectoplasm. If they faltered even for a second, the spell would either fail or produce a hopelessly false copy. This was because, although the spell was tapping into the caster's soul to create the copy, it was tapping into something that described a creature of flesh and blood and trying to translate it into a form made out of magical fields and ectoplasm. A multitude of little and not so little sacrifices and compromises had to be made during this process, and a non-sapient spell couldn't be trusted to prioritize things properly. The first time Zorian succeeded in producing a simulacrum, for example, he got a nearly mindless wreck that nonetheless contained a vividly detailed internal bone structure. The spell sacrificed nearly everything else to get that one thing just right. Of course, Zorian was now too well versed with the spell to fail like that, even with Zack distracting him with inane comments. The writhing sphere swelled in size and erupted into thin rope-like pseudopods that formed a rough outline of a human being. 2 minutes later, a flawless-looking replica of Zorian opened its eyes and looked around. One would think that simulacrums would come into existence already aware of everything and ready to spring into action on a moment's notice. But in practice they always seemed a little confused after being created and took about 30 seconds to gather their bearings and calm down. "There," Zorian said. "Anything else?" "No," Alanik said, shaking his head. "Go. Try not to get yourself killed, I guess." "I guess." Zorian mumbled under his breath. "Thank you, Alanik. You really know how to make a motivational speech." And then he left. The attack on the Ibasan base beneath Cyoria had begun. Break. The initial stages of the infiltration went very well. Zorian used a combination of a floating invisibility sphere and clouding the minds of the Ibasan guards to smuggle himself and the Arania into the base, after which they split up into small groups to cover more ground in as little time as possible. There were some complications. For one thing, there were some pretty insidious and powerful wards scattered around the base, arranged in no pattern that Zorian could decipher. These hadn't been there when Zorian invaded the base in the previous restarts, which implied that Ibasans normally took those down before executing the invasion of Cyoria. Zorian was kind of baffled as to why they would tear down their own wards like that, though even if they did intend to abandon the base after the invasion. For a moment he actually worried that they had been betrayed by some of their mercenaries, despite their precautions, and that the base security had been upgraded in response. However, the wards in question were arranged so haphazardly, the entire warding layout so full of holes, that Zorian eventually ruled out that idea. If the Ibasans had been expecting them, they would have done a better job of warding the place than this. As it was, the warding setup looked almost like a collection of individual wards, each of which had been erected by a different person without bothering to consult anyone else about what they were doing. In at least 2 places the wards clashed with each other so severely that they created dead zones in the areas where they overlapped, cancelling each other out. Zorian had a rather silly urge to write a letter to Quatakikal, criticizing him for not teaching his minions how to make a proper warding scheme. This sort of thing reflected badly on him too, he ought to think of his reputation. Anyway. Another problem was the Ibasans had these brown dogs that could smell the Arania coming, no matter how well cloaked, and wouldn't stop barking. And they were either naturally mind-blanked or had been made so artificially, because Zorian couldn't detect or connect to their minds at all. He had been forced to kill and replace them with motionless ectoplasmic replicas, which took an annoying amount of time and mana on his part. After that, everything went perfectly for a while. Numerous Ibasan leaders were eliminated, and though the base was starting to wake up to the fact something funny was going on in their base, they were still not aware of the extent of the problem on their hands. However, there was something that Zorian had not taken into account. The Ibasans had fought against Arania before the time loop. And even during the time loop before Red Robe erased them from the time loop, the Cyorean web had been a huge obstacle to their operations. As such, they had a multitude of countermeasures and defenses aimed specifically against the Arania. Many of these were abandoned when the local Arania mysteriously disappeared, experts in charge of manning them reassigned to other, more productive duties, but some of them remained intact, just in case. When the Arania moved near the center of the base, they seemed to cross some invisible line that immediately triggered a base-wide alarm. It was loud, shrill, and everyone in the base seemed to immediately realize what it meant because they immediately started layering mental protection spells on themselves and grabbing their weapons. Oops. The Arania closest to Zorian said hesitantly. I don't even understand what got us, another complained. Human magic is such bullshit. Zorian snorted derisively. Well, it wasn't like this was completely unexpected. He reached out with his mind, connecting himself with the network of telepathic relays that had been densely distributed across this entire section of the underworld, and ordered the miniature monster horde he had gathered to attack the base from all directions. From one of the tunnels, a huge red centipede surged forwards, hordes of hook goblins and cave drakes following after it. The Ibasans concentrated their fire at the centipede first, trying to bring down the biggest threat, only to see most of their spells fizzle out due to the many wards Zorian had attached to it. From another tunnel, a swarm of floating, jellyfish-like monsters came pouring in. They looked slow and weak, but when Ibasans tried to bring them down they discovered that the jellyfish had an innate shielding magic that blocked their projectiles. Worse, the jellyfish could somehow interface with one another and merge their shields into a stronger, unified barrier. From the third tunnel, a horde of phalanx toads came rushing into the base. The Ibasans killed many of them, but there were 5 more for each they killed, and they acted with unusual organization and discipline, spontaneously forming into coherent groups and sweeping everything before them with their spear-like tongues. Finally, the 4th group of monsters didn't bother moving through any of the existing tunnels. The rockworms Zorian subverted simply burst into the base from down below, having dug out their own entrance into the base. The whole plan had a high chance of falling apart at this moment, Zorian knew. Although he and the Arania had gutted a lot of their leadership, they hadn't gotten everyone that could summon Quatakikal. If the Abasins wanted to call the ancient Lich for help, they could. However, Zorian had noticed in the past that Abasins were generally reluctant to call upon their leader. Quatakikl hated getting called to deal with trivial things. He didn't usually kill people for disappointing him in such a manner, but he was rather prone of relieving them of their positions or reducing their salary, which were horrifying enough consequences for most people. Zorian was hoping that the Abasins, faced with what appeared to be an Iranian attack, would decide to try and tackle things on their own, rather than immediately call Quatakikl to help them. Well, he seemed to have been right about that. The Abasins chose to fight the monster invasion on their own. The trouble is, they were winning. The centipede was intercepted by trolls and bludgeoned to death with sheer force of numbers. The jellyfish shield was visibly weakening and the phalanx toads were being pushed back with a liberal application of fire. As for the rockworms, well, the Abasins had rockworms of their own. Zorian had counted on the monster horde getting defeated, but not this fast. He wasn't done killing the leadership yet, damn it. He suddenly got a message from his simulacrum that Zack wanted to help out with the assassination. Well, the plan was already failing, so he supposed there was no harm in letting Zack wreck things for a bit before they abort the whole thing. As quickly as possible, he synchronized with his simulacrum and opened a gate between the command room and the Abasin base, letting Zack pass through. Zack took a rather long look at the battlefield, taking in how the battles were progressing firsthand, and then turned to Zorian. Do you know where those leaders are at the moment? Sort of. Zorian said. I mostly had the Arania pinpointing their location for me, but they're kind of busy directing the monster horde at the moment. But you know the general area they're in, right? Zack prodded. Oh yeah, Zorian nodded. He pointed at a big, solidly constructed building not far from them. Most of the surviving ones are in that building over there. The wards are pretty tricky, so it will take me some time to... Before Zorian could finish speaking, Zack had already fired some kind of projectile at the building. It was seemingly tiny, more of a faint red pinprick of light than a proper-looking offensive spell, but its flight path was followed with a piercing scream so loud it made Zorian's ears hurt. The projectile slammed into the wall of the building and then burst into crescent spatial distortions that sliced through everything in the vicinity with no visible resistance. The whole heavily warded building fell apart like an apple thrown into an industrial blender machine, burying everyone in it under several tons of rubble. One problem solved, said Zack, lowering his hand. What about the others? Well, said Zorian a little sourly. Only a little, though. Truthfully, he had been expecting something like this when he agreed to involve Zack into this. If the Abasins didn't already know they're under attack by more than just Arania, they certainly do now. Let's see if we can kill them before they realize just how disgustingly powerful you are and call Quatakikl in panic. Let's, Zack agreed. Deciding there was no point in pretending this attack was just a minor Iranian offensive anymore, Zorian sent a telepathic message to Svim and Alanik to start the assault in earnest. He received a confirmation almost immediately. It seemed Zack wasn't the only one who was spoiling for a fight. Zorian understood. They had all spent so much time and resources into organizing this attack. It would be almost a crime to call it off now. It was time for Abasins to see what it's like to be suddenly invaded. Beneath the city of Syoria, a vicious battle was underway. The small army that Alanik had assembled, bolstered by the various mercenaries, Zorian's golems and what was left of the dominated monster horde, advanced deep into the disorganized Abasin ranks. However, the Abasins weren't just passive victims. Despite having their entire high-ranking leadership gutted by Zack and Zorian, despite the huge losses they suffered in the initial attack from the monster horde, despite the shock they must have felt at the appearance of another human army, the Abasins still resisted the attack with considerable might. Their top leadership may have fallen, but local commanders quickly assumed control of the remaining forces and did their best to link up and coordinate their movements. Huge war golems charged into rapidly forming defense groups, aiming to break them up, only to be met with screaming hordes of war trolls barring their way. The Arania led the remaining monsters into suicidal offensives, only to be countered with equally suicidal delaying actions from the Abasins' own war beasts. Zack and Zorian converged on any local commander that seemed to be especially good at their job, aided by a couple of Alanik's men that seemed to be really accurate with a rifle and fond of headshots, but there was always someone wily and capable of replacing them once they moved on to other targets. Currently, Zorian's simulacrum was standing in the vicinity of the dimensional gate at the center of the Abasin settlement, where Svim and Olenek had moved shortly after the attack began. Unfortunately, the gate had been shut down by the Abasins when they realized they were going to lose it. Another thing that didn't go according to plan. Even if they managed to win this, a powered-down gate stabilization frame was much less useful as an object of study than a working dimensional gate. "We should have brought more monsters," Olenek said suddenly, standing not far from the simulacrum and observing the battlefield. "We should have brought more everything really, but I don't think we could have realistically recruited more people. We're doing very well compared to the numbers arrayed against us, but it's not enough. There are simply too few of us compared to the number of Abasins gathered here. We were afraid that if we sent too many monsters, it would spook them into calling Quatakikl immediately," the simulacrum pointed out. "Though considering how successful they were against the Horde, I agree we were probably too conservative with them. Speaking of which, did Zack and Zorian manage to eliminate the Abasin leaders before they contacted Quatakikl for help or not?" Svim asked. The simulacrum quickly contacted the original and asked him that same question. 10 seconds later he turned back to Svim. "It's doubtful," he said, shaking his head. "They had trouble locating the last two leaders. They're dead now, but they had plenty of time to realize how dire the situation is and call for help." Svim said nothing for a second, looking thoughtfully at the powered-down gate next to them. "We shouldn't have taken the gate from them so quickly," Svim said. "We should have left it in their hands for a while to give them an avenue of retreat. I think they would have tried to fall back into that undead mansion instead of fighting a lost battle if they had a choice. Or they might have found a way to commandeer some of Sudamir's undead minions if given enough time, making our current issue even worse," the simulacrum said with a shrug. "We'll analyze what we did wrong later," said Olenek firmly. "What we need now is solutions. How do we salvage this situation?" "Shouldn't we just retreat?" asked Svim curiously. "Even if we take the base in the end, it will take us many hours to do so and cost many lives. On top of that, there is a high chance that Quatakikl will come back before we are done and tip the balance in Abasin favor." Olenek said nothing for a few seconds, clearly discontent with that idea. "I have an idea," the simulacrum eventually said. "Why don't we just rip the gate stabilization frame out of the ground, pedestal and all, and carry it off to the surface for study? I mean, the original reason why we wanted to secure the base and do our research here was because moving an active dimensional gate was impossible. But we don't have an active gate. We have an inert stabilization frame, so what stops us from simply carrying it off somewhere else before trying to figure it out?" Svim and Olenek gave him surprised looks. "What?" the simulacrum asked defensively. "The idea has merit." "It does," Olenek agreed. "I was just surprised to see you make such a suggestion. Sometimes I forget simulacrums like you are more than just extensions of Zorian and can have ideas of your own." "Same," Svim agreed. The simulacrum scowled. "Stupid flesh-and-blood people and their prejudices." Soon, Svim and Olenek ordered their forces to fall back a little and threw themselves into the task of cutting the gate stabilization frame free of the ground without damaging something crucial. The pedestal the frame was affixed to had some kind of root-like structure that extended into the rock beneath it, meaning that a surprisingly large chunk of the ground had to be taken along with the gate itself. None of the problems were in any way insurmountable, though, and the whole thing was soon floated into the air and slowly pushed towards one of the base exits. The movement did not go unnoticed, however, and when the Abasins saw what they were doing, they went completely berserk. Apparently they really hated the idea of the gate stabilization frame being carried away like that. From that moment on, the whole battle shifted in tone. Instead of trying to minimize their losses and stalling for time, the Abasins suddenly surged forward and tried to recover the stolen gate at all costs. Alanek's forces shifted from trying to put pressure on the Abasins to a strictly defensive posture, trying to keep the Abasins away from the retreating gate with equal zeal. The situation only grew more dire soon after that, as Abasins realized that recovering the gate was a lost cause and started trying to destroy it instead. "Why are they so upset about us taking the gate?" Zack shouted while creating a thick prismatic wall in between the floating gate stabilization frame and the approaching Abasin war party. He was just in time. The moment the barrier snapped into place, 3 different projectiles slammed into it: a thin blue javelin of force that crackled with some kind of magical energy, an animated serpent made out of green fire, and a large white sphere that had smaller red spheres orbiting around it. The wall flickered, cycling through different colors, and for a moment it seemed it would hold. but then the three projectiles combined together to release some kind of combined pulse that disrupted the barrier and it fell apart into multicolored smoke. The fire serpent, the only survivor of this clash of spells, surged madly towards the floating gate, seeking to detonate itself against its surface. It never reached it. A milky white sphere soon hit it in the flank, courtesy of Zorian, causing it to fall apart into rapidly fading clusters of green fire. They're afraid of what Quatakikal will do to them when he finds out they let someone acquire a sample of his work, Zorian said. The simulacrum suspected the original had taken said information straight from the minds of nearby Ebasans. He doesn't even let his allies examine it. How do you think he would feel about this? The battle raged on. The simulacrum watched, rather discontent, as people fought all around him to either destroy or preserve the floating gate. He couldn't do much himself as any significant mana use would cripple the original's ability to fight, so he was reduced to a role of observer for the most part. He watched the battle carefully, scrutinizing every detail in hopes of spotting something that required his attention. The Ebasans charged forward again and again, supported by long-range spells from their allies in the back ranks, only to be repulsed. Zorian's golems slowly dwindled in number, the volume of spell fire too much even for their heavy wards to handle. When they grew too damaged to be of much use, Zorian strapped alchemical bombs all over them and sent them into suicide charges to halt particularly troublesome offensives. Zack's spells reaped a bloody toll on Ebasan forces, but not even his mana reserves were endless and the time he spent in recovery gradually increased as the battle grew more heated. One of the Ebasan mages decided to sacrifice his life for the cause. As he finished casting his last spell, he removed a ritual dagger from his belt and slit his own throat, using some blood magic to pour every shred of his life force into it. The resulting spell produced an incandescent meteor that punched through every single obstacle in front of it, and would have no doubt reduced the floating gate into molten rubble if Svim hadn't used a series of dimensional gates to redirect it back at the Ebasans. Finally, the simulacrum noticed something he felt merited his attention. On the edges of the main battlefield, a small group of friendly soldiers was being overwhelmed. Of the original 15, most were already dead. Only 6 still lived and only 3 of those 6 could walk and fight properly. The simulacrum telepathically alerted the original to the situation, but was told everyone was currently busy and that sacrifices have to be made in situations like these. The simulacrum then pointed out to him that one of the survivors was Taven. The original immediately changed his mind and told the simulacrum to go and help them. The simulacrum wouldn't have actually obeyed in order to leave Taven to her fate, but it was nice that he and the original were still on the same page in this regard. He teleported next to the group and immediately intercepted an incoming fireball with a well-placed dispelling wave. Taven's shocked face was kind of priceless. "What are you waiting for?" the simulacrum asked the group. One of the Ebasans tried to sneak up on them by kicking up a cloud of dust with a misaimed spell and using it as a cover for his approach. He received a force lance to the face for his trouble. "This position is lost. Why haven't you regrouped elsewhere?" "We can't leave them," Taven protested, pointing at the 3 wounded soldiers next to her. "I told you to leave us here," one of the wounded soldiers said. "Just go. We'll stall them to buy you some time. We're not leaving anyone behind," Taven insisted. The other 2 healthy soldiers said nothing, but the simulacrum could see on their faces that they didn't want to leave the wounded soldiers behind either. They were probably friends. "How about this? You go and take these people to safety and I'll hold the Ebasans at bay," the simulacrum offered. "Zorian," Taven started, sounding both a little annoyed and a little worried. The simulacrum wasn't listening to her anymore though. He could feel the Ebasans moving towards the group again, so he conjured 2 large severing discs above his palms and launched them forward in front of him. The first wave of Ebasans literally fell apart before the discs, screaming horribly as they were effortlessly sliced apart by the 2 buzzing spell constructs. The commander of the Ebasan group tried to restore order to his unit, shouting orders and threats so loudly the entire base must have heard him. He fell silent when his own bodyguard slammed a knife in his eye socket, killing him instantly. The apparent betrayal, which was actually the result of Zorian puppeteering the man's body, not genuine betrayal, further sowed chaos in the Ebasan group, stalling the attack. The simulacrum then shifted his attention back to Taven and her group, only to find the soldiers gone but Taven still present. "Let me guess," the simulacrum sighed. You sent the rest of them to safety but decided to stay behind with me? I told you, she said. We're not leaving anyone behind. In retrospect, he really should have made it clear he was a simulacrum right from the start. Listen, he started. I'm actually... Stupid simulacrum. The original's voice thundered in his mind. What the hell are you doing down there? The rest of the soldiers are back but you and Taven aren't? Stop fooling around and spending all our mana, damn it. I need that to defend the gate. The simulacrum winced at the angry tirade in his head. The interruption left him confused for a second, unable to remember what he was doing right before the original contacted him. He was further distracted when another volley of spells erupted towards the two of them, roughly half of it directed at him and the other half at Taven. Taven blocked her share of projectiles easily enough, and the simulacrum was just about to do the same for himself when he felt his mana reserves rapidly drain away. Apparently the original had decided to blow his entire mana reserves on something, leaving them both defenseless for a while. Damn it, original, the simulacrum quietly grumbled. Then the spell volley hit him, tearing straight into him and blowing his ectoplasmic form into rapidly fading pieces. As his tattered remains started to unravel, he spared one last look at Taven, who was looking at him with an absolutely horrified look on her face. Only then did he remember what he had been trying to tell her before the original contacted him. His last fading thought was that he really should have made it clear that he was just a simulacrum right from the start. In the end, they managed to extract the gate stabilization frame out of the Abasin base safe and intact. The frenzied attempts of the Abasin forces to stop them had petered out after a while, the surviving soldiers retreating back to their base and allowing them to withdraw in peace. The forces assembled by Alanik and Zorian had paid a heavy price for this success, however, being cut nearly in half by the end. Only time would tell if the researchers Svim gathered would find out anything useful about the recovered gate stabilization frame. As they suspected, Quatakikal showed up not long after they finished their retreat, having received a call for help at some point in the fight. Zack and Zorian had been on edge for a few days after this, expecting the Abasins to launch a premature invasion of Cyoria, much like they had in that one restart where Zorian prodded Eldamar into attacking Ayaska Mansion. But what happened instead is that the remaining Abasins started to withdraw from Cyoria entirely. The invasion, it seemed, was being cancelled. Chapter 071. Shadows of the Past. After the attack on the Abasin base had been concluded and it became obvious that no immediate invasion would result from it, Zorian proceeded to re-establish his link to Koth. Since he had dismissed his simulacrum in Koth before the attack, he had to rely on Daemon's help for the second time in the restart. Although it kind of bothered him that he was forced to rely on Daemon so much, he had to admit his help made things a lot easier than they would have otherwise been. He didn't expect any problems to crop up, and in a way there really hadn't been any. The dimensional gate opened just fine after all. The problem was that it opened directly inside the Terramachula estate. Instead of finding some out-of-the-way location in the jungle, like they had agreed on beforehand, Daemon had decided to simply open the gate inside a heavily warded room meant for receiving teleporting visitors. While a dozen or so Terramachula family members stood around the edges of the room and watched. Zorian, who had stepped through the gate first, was so shocked at the sight that he immediately halted in his tracks. This caused Zack, who was coming right behind him, to crash into him. Thankfully, they managed to keep their balance instead of falling to the floor in a tangle of limbs. That would have been awkward. Hey, why did you Estio? Oh. That's a lot bigger reception than I was expecting, Zack said, looking around. Zorian didn't bother responding to Zack's feeble attempt at humor. Instead, he zeroed in on his older brother and gave him an outraged glare. Daemon, what the hell were you thinking? To his credit, Daemon actually winced at the question, looking properly guilty. I'm sorry, he said, waving his hands in front of him in a placating gesture. I didn't have a choice, okay? I can't leave the Terramachula estate anymore, and I couldn't just open a dimensional gate in their home without their knowledge or consent. It was either this or aborting the whole thing entirely. Zack and Zorian were quiet for a second, processing that statement. Why can't you leave the Terramachula estate? Zack finally asked. Are you a prisoner or something? It's complicated, Daemon said with a heavy sigh. Let's go find somewhere quiet to talk. Before either Zack or Zorian could say anything, one of the gathered Terramachula decided to cut in and make a suggestion. It was Ilana, the woman who had greeted them the first time they had visited the estate. I know just the place, Ilana said. For a family of our stature, not having an appropriate meeting room for occasions such as these would be quite an embarrassment. Please wait a minute while I make some arrangements and then we can go. Zorian gave Alana a thoughtful look. Though her words made it seem she was just trying to be a good host, he could understand the underlying message easily enough. The Terramachula were an involved party in all this and they wanted to be present during the talk. Alana raised an eyebrow at his look as if daring him to object. He didn't. That's quite all right, he simply said. Me and Zack will go collapse the gate while you deal with things on your end. Zorian had no idea what Daimon had told the Terramachula about the gate. Hopefully he hadn't been foolish enough to reveal that he and Zorian were opening passages between two different continents, in which case it was imperative that they close the gate quickly, before they could puzzle out the truth for themselves. As he and Zack worked to collapse the gate, he could hear Alana conversing with some of the other Terramachula in the room. His grasp on the local language was still very poor, so the only thing he understood was that she ordered food and drink to be made and brought to them. Zorian was in no mood for either, but he figured out it would be impolite to try and stop her. A little while later they were all ushered into a relatively small but luxurious room. There were 5 of them present: Ulana, Daimon, Orisa, Zack and Zorian. Despite the presence of Ulana and Orisa, though, it was Daimon that provided most of the explanation for what was happening. Apparently one or more members of Damon's team had talked to outsiders about the orb they had found, and the story had blown up very quickly. Within hours, everyone and their mother wanted to speak to Daimon to find out what he intended to do with the orb and to try and influence him to sell it to whatever group they represented. Caught off guard by the sudden flood of interested buyers and aware that not everyone was willing to take their refusal to sell the orb in good grace, Daimon and his team retreated to the Terramachula estate and barricaded themselves there until further notice. The people after us can't afford to be too brazen with the Terramachula, so we're safe while we remain inside the estate, Daimon concluded. But the moment we step out we'll be ambushed by dozens of different groups. They know we're in here. They have the estate heavily monitored. Everyone and everything going in or out of the estate is closely tracked. I couldn't possibly leave the estate to open the gate elsewhere. Maybe I'm just stupid, but why don't the Terramachula simply tell all these people to back off? They're supposed to be the main political force here, no? Zack asked. I'm afraid it's not that simple, Alana said. There are too many powerful groups making their moves here, quite a few of them from outside our sphere of influence. Though they cannot afford to take us lightly, the same is true for us as well. This is a sensitive situation and we have to move carefully. Rest assured, though, that we are taking note of every slight against us for when the time is right. Another issue is that some elements of the local government are discussing the possibility of simply confiscating the orb from us by force, Daimon said. The Terramachula have to spend a lot of their influence on making sure that the initiative doesn't get anywhere. Damn it, I knew it was important to keep this find a secret, but I had no idea it would inspire this sort of greed. It's a portable pocket dimension of massive size, Orisa pointed out. On top of that, it contains ruins from the Age of Gods, and probably the remains of Awantemti's wealth. There could be divine artifacts in there, plants and animals that have gone extinct in the rest of the world, anything. Of course it inspires so much greed. You're fortunate you have the Terramachula family to shield you from all this while we figure out what to do. Yes, I get it, Daimon said patiently. I'm lucky to have you, dear. Have you made any trips to the pocket dimension yet? Zack asked curiously. We haven't even discovered how to deploy the orb, Daimon said, shaking his head. We don't have a command marker like Zorian does, so we have to do things the hard way. Meaning? Zack prodded for details. We have to reverse engineer the control spells that are used for operating the orb, Daimon said. A generational treasure like this one would definitely have a method of controlling the orb without a command marker as a safety measure if nothing else. We just have to find it. Unfortunately, that could take a while. Daimon gave Zorian a meaningful look. Though Zorian didn't know for sure what he was trying to tell him, he could guess. While finding a way to operate the orb without a marker was not a priority for him and Zack, it would mean a lot for Daimon. He was probably well aware that Zorian had no intention whatsoever of revealing his abilities to Daimon outside the time loop, which would make those control spells absolutely crucial to his mission. Without them, even removing the orb from its resting place would be impossible, greatly complicating everything. Even if we had the means of operating the orb, We would still refrain from sending an expedition to its interior at this time, Orissa noted. The possibility of further guardian beasts like that god-touched Hydra is too high. Months of preparation would be required to mount a proper expedition, and the current political situation makes such preparations impossible. Yes, exactly, Diamond quickly agreed. He turned to Zack and Zorian. And because I'm stuck here all the time, I can't really hire the experts I need to figure out how to operate the orb either. The truth is that I have very little to do here. I was thinking it might be a good idea for me to disappear for a few days. Get the orb away from covetous eyes and talk to some old friends about my options. This again, Orissa said with an unhappy frown. This sparked a brief argument between Orissa and Diamond, since Diamond didn't want to explain what exactly he was up to and Orissa insisted that she had every right to know the details. In all honesty, Zorian thought Orissa's position was quite reasonable and empathized with her frustration at Damon's evasiveness. However, he also couldn't fault Diamond for this, since it wasn't like he could just openly say that. If you want us to take you back to Cyoria with us when we reopen the gate, you should just say so, Zack said. Everyone sent him a shocked look. Well, everyone except Zorian. He just buried his face in his hands and tried to take deep breaths. Damn it, Zack, he mumbled into his hands. What? Zack protested, giving Zorian an exasperated look. Any story you and Diamond cook up wouldn't last a day and you know it. They're not stupid. They'd figure it out soon enough. Thank you, Mr. Novita, Ilana told him. I'm glad that at least one man here respects our reasoning skills. Zack gave her a thumbs up and a sunny grin. You're saying you opened a dimensional passage here all the way from Aldemar? Orissa asked, sounding just a little bit incredulous. We do a lot of crazy stuff, Zack said with a careless shrug. It turned out that neither Ilana nor Orissa were very familiar with the details of how the gate spell works. This wasn't very surprising as the spell was extremely rare, but somehow Zorian kept forgetting little details like that. After Zorian gave them a brief explanation of how the gate spell functioned, Orissa gave him a strange look. What? Zorian asked, feeling somewhat self-conscious. This method you use to ignore distance limitations requires another person helping you on the other side, yes? She asked. Zorian nodded wordlessly. Then how can you open a gate back to Aldemar? Can the third Kaczynski brother cast the gate spell too? What for of? Please, Zorian scoffed. He'll be lucky not to flunk out of the academy. Zorian. Diamond protested. He never liked it when Zorian badmouthed the rest of the family. No, we'll be using the simulacrum I left back in Cyoria, Zorian said, completely ignoring Damon's outburst. Since I can cast the gate spell, my simulacrum can obviously do the same. Oh, so you can create a simulacrum too? Ilana asked casually, not sounding particularly surprised. Zorian had to hand it to her. She was very good at projecting an aura of serene confidence. Orissa seemed to be trying to mimic that attitude, but she was nowhere near good enough to pull it off. One could see that these kind of reveals bothered her and put her somewhat off balance. We do a lot of crazy stuff, Zorian said. He thought about mimicking Zack completely and giving her a thumbs up and a cheeky smile, but quickly dropped the idea. That sort of thing was something only Zack could pull off without looking like a total idiot. In the end, they managed to hammer out an agreement. Diamond would return to Cyoria with Zack and Zorian and would take the orb of the first emperor along with him. Zorian would leave a simulacrum in the Terramachula estate so that they could return via gate spell in exactly 4 days. Zorian thought this would be the end of it, but his hopes were ruthlessly squashed when Diamond told him he still had to explain to his team that he would be away for a while. For a moment, Zorian felt the urge to make an overdramatic gesture to the uncaring heavens. And here he thought this would just be a short visit to Koth, consisting of little more than replacing his lost simulacrum and asking Diamond if he had found out anything new about the orb. Sometimes he just couldn't win. It was a massive relief to Zorian when the three of them finally stepped through the gate and returned to Cyoria. Both the Terramachula and Damon's team were on edge right now, and thus rather exasperating to deal with. He kind of felt bad for his simulacrum who would be stuck with them for the next several days. Oh well, at least he had Kerma and Torin to talk to. Those two were fairly interesting and he suspected he might be able to broker some kind of trade with at least one of them. Regardless, he was back and could devote himself to other matters. Svim's efforts to convince various experts to trade their secrets with him had been reasonably successful. Sudamir had to be properly interrogated, The efforts of the researchers to understand the Ebasin gate stabilization frame were starting to bear fruit, and the silent doorway adepts were hinting that they were willing to send a group over to Koth to acquire a gate key. Sadly, recent events concerning Diamond and the orb had probably made that last idea a dead end in this restart. His simulacrum couldn't possibly leave the Terramachula estate without 100 pairs of eyes following his every move. Unfortunate. He could really use an alternate entrance to Koth that didn't rely on Diamond right now. He would have to assign a high priority to this idea in future restarts. Diamond had agreed to hand over the orb to him and Zack while he was in Cyoria. Partially because he figured they could find out far more about it than he could, due to possessing a marker that could actually operate it, and partially because he wasn't entirely sure the orb would be safe in his possession. News traveled faster than people. By all rights, his little trip to Cyoria should have gone undetected by his pursuers, but he couldn't be completely sure. Thus, he felt it was for the best if he didn't have the orb on him unless absolutely necessary. Zorian expected that he would be the only one that could tinker with the orb to discover its secrets, since Zack didn't have the necessary personal soul awareness to control his marker. He was very much wrong. Apparently, Zack didn't need to have conscious control over his marker to take command of the orb. After an hour or so of tinkering with the orb, Zack managed to connect to it instinctively. And after that one success, he no longer needed an hour of tinkering to connect to again. Simply touching the orb would be enough to re-establish contact. Zack didn't even have to concentrate on it to pull it off. A touch and a stray thought were enough. Zorian was a little sour about that. The orb certainly never reacted that way to him, no matter how many hours he spent interacting with it. No, he had to spend months going through that hellish soul awareness training and then more time painstakingly studying the way the marker worked to get as far as he did. This sort of stuff really made it obvious that his marker was some kind of inferior version of the one on Zack. It had been only a day since they were back in Cyoria when Diamond surprised him again. He wanted to talk to Kiriel and Fortov. This was a bit of a problem. Both of their siblings knew for a fact that Diamond shouldn't be in Cyoria. Mother and father had gone to Koth to meet with him. How on earth did he intend to explain his presence here? But Diamond insisted that he needed to do this, and Zorian didn't feel like arguing with him. There was probably no great harm in it, and he was pretty sure that Diamond would go and have those conversations behind his back if he was too stubborn. Amusingly, Diamond wanted to talk to Kiriel and Fortov alone, without anyone else being present. Zorian was almost certain that meant he wanted to ask them specifically about Zorian. Fortov didn't know anything about Zorian, and Kiriel was a little tattletale and would no doubt tell Zorian everything that she and Diamond talked about. But he told Diamond none of that and simply wished him luck before sending him on his way. The next day Diamond came back to talk to him looking lost and confused. "They didn't even want to talk to me," he complained, sounding quite dejected. It actually made Zorian feel bad for him somewhat. "Come on, it's not that bad," Zorian comforted him. "I don't know about Fortov, but I'm pretty sure Kiriel wouldn't have snubbed you like that. Amaya tells me you spent an entire hour with her." "Yeah, but that's all I did with her," Diamond complained. "She spent the entire hour fidgeting and looking uncomfortable. She barely spoke, and only when I specifically prodded her. I'm not entirely sure, but I think she was actually a little scared of me." "That's..." Damien waved his hands in the air, as if trying to convey some kind of unpronounceable concept through silent gesticulation. "Sad," Zorian offered. "Sure, let's go with that," Diamond said. "Also worrying. And upsetting. And a whole host of other things. Especially when coupled with what happened with Fortov. Do you know what happened when I knocked on his door?" "Not really, no," Zorian told him. He had actually known about Damon's talk with Kiriel, since she had told him all about it when he had come to Amaya's place in the evening, but he honestly had no idea how Damon's talk with Fortov had gone. Not well, obviously, but it would be interesting to hear why. "What did he do?" "He was just really abrasive to me right from the start," Diamond said. "He refused to even let me in, eventually started shouting at me and then slammed the door in my face and ignored me." Interesting. Diamond looked at Zorian, silently asking him for an explanation. Zorian said nothing though, and Diamond grew visibly frustrated as seconds ticked by. He ran both of his hands through his hair and clutched it tightly in his fists as if wanting to tear it off. "You're going to go prematurely bald if you keep doing that," Zorian commented lightly. Diamond gave him an unamused glare. But he did remove his hands from his head. "I don't understand." Daimen protested loudly. Am I such a horrible older brother? I knew you didn't like me, but even Fortov? Even little Kiriel? Why? What did I do? Zorian clacked his tongue and considered things for a second. On one hand, he felt that Daimen was getting exactly what he deserved. On the other hand, the fact that Daimen was so upset over this meant that his mental image of him was a little unfair. He decided to be a little nice to his older brother for a change. In regards to Kiriel, the answer is simple, my dear eldest brother, Zorian told him. You're practically a stranger to her. By the time she was old enough to interact with people, you were almost never at home. When was the last time you talked with her? Disregarding yesterday's meeting, of course. Daimen fumbled. You can't even remember, Zorian stated, shaking his head. Anyway, all she had of you were stories she heard of you. Most of which came either from mother or from me. After all, I'm one of the people who interacted with her the most over the years. Oh, heavens help me, Daimen lamented. What exactly did you tell her about me? The truth, Zorian shrugged. You mean your truth, Daimen accused. Of course, Zorian responded, completely unmoved by the accusation. But don't worry, I kept quiet about your worst excesses. Truth be told, I never liked talking about you to anyone, and that included Kiriel. And besides, Mother never failed to take your side in everything. If it were just the matter of stories, Kiriel would be more ambivalent to you. The thing is, she needs help, and she knows she'll never get it from you. She just might get it from me though, which is why she doesn't want to sabotage her relations with me by getting cozy with you. She knows you kind of piss me off. What do you mean she needs help? Daimen frowned. And why are you so sure she'd never get it from me? Because it would require standing up to Mother, Zorian said. Over the next hour or so, Zorian tried to familiarize Daimen with Kiriel's situation. The arranged marriage their parents had prepared for her. Her desire to learn magic like the rest of them. He tried to keep the explanations brief, worried that telling this to Daimen constituted some kind of betrayal towards Kiriel, who had told him these things in confidence. He said enough for Daimen to form a rudimentary picture of what was happening with Kiriel behind the scenes, though. I can't believe I never heard of this, Daimen said, his eyes somewhat unfocused as he seemed to recall something in his head. I speak to Mother and Father often and they never mentioned this. Did you ever actually ask them about Kiriel? Zorian asked. Daimen was quiet for a few moments. No, he eventually admitted. Well, there you go, Zorian shrugged. Daimen exhaled heavily and then corrected his posture, sitting a little straighter in his chair. Okay, I admit I haven't been very fair to our little sister. I guess I kind of deserved such a chilly reception from her, Daimen said. What about Fortov then? What's his deal? How would I know? Zorian protested. Do you honestly think I speak to Fortov about you? Daimen gave him an annoyed huff. Yes, I get it. You never talk about me to anyone if you can help it. But surely you have some inkling about how Fortov thinks and what bothers him. You've been interacting with him for 6 years now. Zorian made a weird face, momentarily struck speechless by the statement. What? Zorian laughed. Whatever gave you that idea? Why would I be interacting with Fortov? Are you serious? Daimen asked incredulously. Zorian stared at him. He's your brother. You live in the same city. You can visit him anytime you want. So? Zorian asked, inclining his head uncomprehendingly. Are you honestly telling me that in all these years, you haven't seriously talked to our brother even once? Daimen asked. His tone was pleading, as if begging Zorian to tell him he's wrong. That's what I'm saying, yes, Zorian nodded. Why would Daimen expect anything else from him? Doesn't the restart end in a massive invasion? Daimen frowned. Zorian nodded again. What does Fortov do during the invasion? Presumably he reaches the academy shelters and spends the night there, along with the other students, Zorian shrugged. Admittedly, the shelters hadn't been very safe during the one occasion he had actually experienced them, but that was when Red Robe had actively been helping the invaders by feeding them information. Without his help, the shelters were actually pretty safe. Presumably? You never checked? Daimen asked. Zorian shook his head in denial. Zorian, for heaven's sake. I don't see why you're so surprised by this, Zorian told him honestly. Fortov is my second least favorite person in the whole family, right after Father. Of course I never bothered to check up on him. Daimen opened his mouth as if he wanted to continue that argument, but then just shook his head and gave up. Never mind, Daimen sighed. Did you have any interactions with him during all this time? Actually yes, Zorian said. He pushes this one girl into a purple creeper patch near the end of every restart and then comes to me to beg for a healing salve. I used to just avoid being home whenever he comes, but these days it's not even necessary. He never comes to find me if I stay at Amaya's place. He pushes this girl into a purple creeper patch regardless of what you change in a restart? Daimen said, frowning. As far as I can tell, yes, Zorian confirmed. The girl has a huge crush on him if that means anything to you. Daimen made a thoughtful hum. It's better than nothing, I guess. But really, Zorian, must you be so petty and callous? I know you and Fortov didn't get along as kids, but this sort of attitude is a little too much. You nurse your grudges way too deeply. It's easy for you to call for peace and understanding, Zorian said, folding his arms over his chest defiantly. It's not you who had to deal with Fortov's crappy attitude over the years. All I'm saying is that maybe you should give him a chance, Daimen said. Like you did with Kiriel when you decided to take her with you to Syoria. If you were wrong about her, who's to say you weren't wrong about Fortov as well? But I wasn't really wrong about her, Zorian pointed out. I didn't want her around because I felt she was a selfish little blabbermouth that would distract me from my studies and tattle on me when she returns to Mother. That's all still true, it's just that I no longer care about that. Provided I actually manage to find a way out of this time loop, my future is set. I can afford a distraction or two, and Kiriel running off and revealing my plans and activities to Mother is irrelevant because our parents can't stop me anymore. I'm so skilled and powerful that I can do whatever I want, Mother and Father be damned. Somewhat surprisingly, Daimen didn't grow even more frustrated at this response, like Zorian thought he would. Instead, he just gave him a sad smile and shook his head ruefully. Mother and Father are so concerned about me making a mistake that they're rushing over to Koth even as we speak to talk me out of my marriage to Orisa. But they fail to notice a crisis developing right in front of them, he said. We really are one messed up family, aren't we? And the terrifying thing in all this is that I will forget all about this very soon, won't I? After the summer festival, it will be as if none of this ever happened. That's so unfair. How the hell can I fix a problem if I have no memory of its existence? I don't think you could fix our family even if you had all the time in the world, Zorian told him. But yes, the reality of the time loop is rather soul-crushing if one really thinks about it. You're dealing with this pretty well, all things considered. It's mostly because I have avoided thinking about it too deeply, I think, Daimen said. Now that we're getting closer to the time limit, I find my thoughts wandering towards it more and more. Especially since I've done so much in these last few weeks. I've realized so many things. Important things. It's frightening and infuriating to realize I must lose it all. Well, I'm sure you've heard about the notebooks I'm transferring between restarts for various people, Zorian noted. If it's really so important, you can just write it down and hand it to me for safekeeping. Oh. Daimen smiled. So I actually qualify for that prestigious service? I must say, the way you've been talking about our family, I was starting to get a little worried. What if you intended to just forget about me in all future restarts? You already know how to find the orb after all, and I know you aren't exactly a big fan of me. Zorian gave him a mildly uncomfortable look. He had been thinking of something like that. Though his eldest brother would surely be useful in tracking down and recovering the rest of the pieces of the key, it bothered Zorian a great deal to rely on Daimen for anything. This felt wrong. Convincing Daimen to help them was a time-consuming task too, so was it really worth the time to include him in their efforts? In the end, he realized he was just looking for excuses. They needed the help that Daimen could provide. If nothing else, it wasn't very fair to Zack to sabotage their chances of getting out of the time loop just because he had a problem with Daimen. Plus the truth was, I was wrong about you, okay? Zorian said with a heavy sigh. I still think you're very annoying, but you're not as bad as the Daimen that lived inside my head. It hurt him to say it, but it was the truth. Maybe Daimen had changed after he had moved out of the house and stopped interacting with Zorian, or maybe Zorian's image of him had never been all that reliable to begin with. Whatever the truth, this Daimen was more helpful and reasonable than the dark giant that had loomed over him in the past. I'm not sure if I'd call it wrong exactly. Regardless of their reasons, the other two siblings don't like me much either. I'm clearly an abject failure as an older brother. It's a sobering realization, Daimen mused. After a second of silence, he shook his head as if to clear it up. But enough of depressing topics like that. You mentioned the notebooks you're carrying across restarts for Svim and the others. As it happens, I've taken the time to talk with Svim yesterday. He told me about the trade deals you two are trying to set up with various experts. Yes, it's honestly one of my better ideas, Sorian nodded. It's already showing results and there is every indication we can do even better in future restarts. I don't think every single one of those experts will agree to a trade in the end, but quite a few are clearly open to the idea if approached by someone they actually respect. Are you thinking of helping Svim convince people? No, Daimon shook his head. I'll be pleased to help if Svim asks for it, but my involvement could easily turn the initiative into an unmitigated disaster. You probably think of my fame as purely beneficial, but the truth is it causes many mages to view me as a threat. A lot of them would never trade anything with me. Why do you think I never learned how to cast the gate spell before you came along? I see, Sorian said thoughtfully. If not that though, why did you mention Svim's efforts? Well, began Daimon. Gathering secret knowledge from Altasia's many experts is a commendable initiative, but it is hard work and it will likely only provide incremental improvement to your capabilities. True, Sorian said. But what's the alternative? All the low-hanging fruit has already been plucked. Not necessarily, Daimon said with a grin. What is and is not low-hanging fruit depends on a person's abilities, and you have something that few other people do, an ability to traverse between continents with ease. Sorian thought about it for a second and then motioned for Daimon to continue. He didn't quite see what he was getting at. What I'm saying is that Koth would be a good place to extend your magic gathering initiative, Daimon continued. Unlike Zlotic, which is relatively well connected to Altazia due to the existence of the teleport network, Koth is quite remote. Despite that, they use the same basic magic system that we do, unlike San. This makes them a great place to find unexpected spell combinations and novel alchemy. Who knows what kind of low-hanging fruit can be obtained by combining our magical traditions with those of Koth. Sorian raised his eyebrow at his eldest brother. Daimon looked quite animated as he spoke of the idea. And I suppose you're volunteering to run this sort of initiative? Sorian asked. Ha ha, Daimon laughed nervously. To be perfectly honest, doing this was one of my objectives in coming to Koth. I was in the process of laying the groundwork for it even before the time loop started. Well, that's great then, Sorian told him honestly. I don't see an issue with the idea then. Great, Daimon said, giving him a sunny smile reminiscent of Zack. It's just that this time loop came too soon and not all of the preparations were complete. I may need a tiny loan from my dearest brother to start things up. Break. A few days later, Daimon was returned to Koth. The orb was left in Cyoria since Daimon figured it was safer that way and because Zack had really taken a liking to it. Busy as he was with other things, Sorian decided to delegate all orb-related tinkering to Zack. Considering how much more strongly the orb reacted to him, Zack may be in a better position to uncover its secrets anyway. Today though, Sorian had received a somewhat unusual request. Taven wanted to talk to him. In private. Normally such a request wouldn't be particularly notable. But Sorian had actually not seen or heard from Taven at all since their attack on the Abasin base. If it were not for Alanik's assurances that she had survived the battle in perfect health, Sorian would have been honestly worried for her. As it was obvious she had been avoiding him for some reason. He had actually thought about tracking her down to ask what was happening, but the end of the restart was approaching and so many things were vying for his time and attention. No matter. Since she'd reached out to him all of a sudden, he would presumably find out what was bothering her quite soon. When they met, he offered to teleport them to some empty, quiet place, but she would have none of that. Apparently when she said she wanted to talk in private, she meant she would bring him to her family training hall. The same one where they sometimes sparred against one another in previous restarts. She seemed to find the place calming and reassuring. So what's this about? He asked her. I'm worried, she said. He sounded worried too. Sorian waited for a few seconds for a clarification of what exactly she was worried about, but Taven seemed to have trouble finding the words. She paced around the training hall like a caged tiger, scowling and shaking her head. No, seriously, what is this about? Sorian asked. She still didn't say anything. Is it time loop related? He added after a bit of thought. Of course it's time loop related, she burst out at him. She looked like she was going to snap at him but quickly managed to rein herself in. She shook her head sadly. And, in a way, it isn't. I don't even know why I called you here. Stupid. I should just. Don't even dare try to send me away now, Sorian warned her. I won't, she assured him. I just realized I probably lost you as a friend. Sorian gave her an incredulous look. And why would you think that? Sorian asked her curiously. Because this time loop has changed you, she told him. You already feel like a stranger to me. You're so hard to read these days and so very capable. Everything I can do you can do better. And that's only going to get worse as you spend time in here. By the time you get out, why would you need me anymore? By the time this is all resolved, I will probably no longer have a friend. You're being overdramatic, Sorian told her. He knew he was probably sounding a little dismissive, but he honestly didn't know what else to tell her. I know you don't remember this, but I spend a lot of time interacting with you in various restarts. There is zero chance that I'm just going to forget you. Well, yes, I'm sure that you won't just forget me, she huffed. But any concern you have for me will be of the, patronizing kind. You'll be so above me it isn't even funny. We won't be equals, you know? It'll be you, a secret archmage, keeping an eye on his old friend for old time's sake. It's very depressing. Ah, said Sorian slowly. There was a lot of truth in what she was saying. There was really no way their friendship would be the same as it had been before the time loop. However, that was not necessarily a bad thing. His past self was somewhat bitter with Taven. He had not considered them to be close friends, something that Taven seemed rather oblivious to. Much like she was oblivious to his past crush on her, really. So yes, their relationship would never be the same. But was that a bad thing? While Taven might lament the loss of their earlier friendship, Sorian couldn't help but wonder whether there would have even been a friendship if he hadn't got stuck in this time loop. Would he have eventually overcome the hurt of having his love confession laughed at and re-established close bonds with her? Probably. But it would have taken quite some time and he wasn't sure Taven would have stuck around him for long enough to see that happen. Why did you ever decide to become friends with me anyway? Sorian asked her curiously. This will sound a little self-deprecating, but I don't think I was that good of a friend. Ha ha, she laughed, her mood brightening a little. Well, it's good that you're so honest. That's the one change I like about the new you. She picked up a practice doll from a nearby bench and started making minute corrections to it. Sorian couldn't see what they were meant to do, so he assumed she was just stalling for time and giving herself something to do. Since you were willing to be a little self-deprecating, I will follow your example, Taven eventually said. I wasn't a very good friend either to you or to anyone else. I'm too blunt and impulsive and I can't judge the situation and people very well. Most people actually find me pretty insulting and aggravating. Sorian was going to say something to cheer her up, but then he remembered that her nickname for him was Roach. He still remembered the argument he'd had with her when she had tried to convince him that being compared to cockroaches was a compliment because they were amazing animals, famed for their adaptability and resilience. Eventually he caved in and, reluctantly, let her call him that, but he could see why some people would be deathly insulted if she were to pull that kind of stunt on them. I actually have very few friends aside from you, she continued. Aside from you, only my two teammates seem to like me. But Yurik and Oren, they're old friends. I'll never be anything other than the third wheel if I hang out around them. But I didn't have any other friends, Sorian surmised. Yeah, Taven told him. You annoyed me, I annoyed you, but we got along with each other anyway. Maybe you weren't a good friend, but I wasn't much better, so it didn't matter. But now you're getting better and I can't. She hugged the practice doll like a little girl trying to comfort herself with a favorite toy. It was a somewhat weird sight since the practice doll was the size of an adult human and creepily featureless. Sorian stared at her, wondering how to handle this. He didn't see how he could convince Taven that the nature of their friendship wouldn't change once he got out of the time loop. It would be an obvious lie. Of course, Sorian did not consider this change to be a bad thing, but to explain why he felt that way he would have to. Why not? If he was really honest with himself, he always had wanted to do this. He just hadn't had the courage to go through with it. I had a crush on you once, he told her. She exclaimed, jerking in surprise and dropping the practice doll. It clattered to the floor, leaving deafening silence in its wake. For a moment anyway. What do you mean you had a crush on me? When? How? Do you remember that time I asked you out on a date? he asked her. What? Are we talking about that time? She fumbled. Zorian nodded anyway. He had only ever asked her to a date once in the time they knew each other, so she couldn't be thinking of anything else. But, isn't that when I laughed at you? Zorian gave her a long-suffering look. Yes, he confirmed. Yes, it is. It wasn't a joke, Taven. I was dead serious about it. Ah ha ha, she laughed nervously. Wow, that's really something. She buried her face into her hands for a moment. Gods above, I'm so stupid sometimes, she mumbled into her hands. Then she punched him in the shoulder. Hey, he protested in mild outrage. He'd normally be more bothered about the sudden physical violence, but it was Taven. He expected that sort of thing from her. What the hell? And you're stupid too, she told him. Why the hell would you just accept me laughing at you like that if you were being serious? Well, what the hell was I supposed to do? Zorian protested. Tell me I was wrong. Ask me out again. Get angry before storming off. Taven shouted. Anything. Not just pretend everything was fine and retreat with a tail between your legs like a wounded puppy. I kept joking about that long afterwards and you still didn't say anything. At least if I knew I wouldn't have been rubbing salt into your wounds like that. It doesn't matter, Zorian grunted. In the end I still got an answer to my question. You clearly weren't interested in me that way. You found the very idea laughable even. Oh come on, she whined. That's not fair. I wasn't laughing because the idea of me dating you was so ridiculous. I was laughing because I gave you love advice urging you to ask people out and you followed it by immediately asking me out. Just seemed to me like you were making a joke. In retrospect I was being stupid, but you should have said something, damn it. There was a long, uncomfortable silence as the two of them refused to look at each other and sat there in silence. We're going out on a date, Taven suddenly declared. Zorian gave her a weird look. But I'm over you, he pointed out. That's why I said I had a crush on you. It's all in the past for me. Yeah, I figured, she said. It doesn't matter. We're still having a date. Don't I get any say in this? Zorian asked, an amused smile on his face. What are you talking about? Taven sniffed disdainfully. You're the one who asked me to a date. I'm just accepting your invitation, with a bit of a delay. Zorian laughed at the uniquely Taven logic. A bit of a delay, she says. You really are something, he said, shaking his head. Fine. Have it your way. Good, she said simply, then looked away as if too shy to meet his eyes. Zorian smiled. He had been telling the truth and he really didn't have a crush for her any longer. Any romantic feeling he'd had for her had petered out during his long stay in the time loop. But he'd be lying if he said he wasn't kind of glad about this.